The price gun was still warm in Darlene's hand when she pressed a sticker onto the handle of my husband's favorite framing hammer and said, "Loud enough for the whole crew to hear? You only married into this business, Rachel. You don't get to touch a man's tools." I stood there in the gravel lot behind the workshop, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and I watched a piece of masking tape with the number $12 written on it curl slightly in the wind. Stuck crooked over the leather grip Mike had worn smooth over 11 years of framing houses in every kind of Pittsburgh weather. Behind Darlene, 3 folding tables were lined up like a church rummage sale, covered in drills and levels and a table saw with a cord wrapped so tight it looked strangled. 6 men from the crew stood near the shop door, not moving, not looking at me. The way people stand still when they know something is about to break. If you have ever stood in a place that used to feel like family and realized it had turned into a marketplace, hit that subscribe button before you keep reading and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It helps more than you know. My name is Rachel Voss. I am 39 years old. I work as a permit coordinator for a small building company here in Pittsburgh. And for 14 years, I was married to a carpenter named Mike Voss, who built half the additions and porches you'd find if you drove through Brookline or Dormont or Beachview. Mike's family had run Voss Renovations since his father hung the first shingle in 1988, and by the time I met Mike, his younger brother Scott was already working the crew. And his mother Darlene was already the kind of woman who believed a wedding ring did not entitle a woman to an opinion about lumber. I never fought Darlene for a place at the center of that family. I found a place at the edge of it, doing the part nobody else wanted, which was the paperwork. Permits, inspections, code compliance, insurance documentation, the parts of a construction business that keep it legal and keep it standing when somebody eventually asks hard questions. I did that work for the company for 9 years before Mike got sick, and I kept doing it for the 11 months he was sick. And I was still doing it 3 weeks after he died, because somebody had to, and because it was the only way I knew how to stay close to something he built. Mike passed in March, on a Tuesday, in a hospital room with a view of a parking garage. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed too late to do much about. The kind of illness that takes a strong man and empties him out in 11 months, like a house being stripped for a renovation. He was 42. We didn't have children. We had a modest house in Dormont with a paid-off truck in the driveway, a joint checking account, and a workshop behind the family's original property on Route 51, where 3 generations of Voss men had kept their tools. What Darlene and Scott didn't know, or chose to forget, was what Mike had done 4 months before he got his diagnosis. Back when he was still healthy enough to think clearly about what would happen to the business and to me if something ever went wrong. But I'm getting ahead of the coffee cup and the price gun. Let me walk you through how a grieving widow ends up standing in a gravel lot watching strangers price her dead husband's hammer for $12. The first sign came 2 weeks after the funeral. When I drove past the workshop on my way home from the permit office downtown and saw Darlene's sedan parked outside, along with Scott's truck. It was a Thursday afternoon, not a work day for me, but I still had a key, so I let myself in through the side door. And I found Darlene standing at Mike's old workbench with a legal pad, writing down numbers next to items I recognized from a decade of watching him work. A cordless nail gun, a laser level, a stack of clamps he'd bought one at a time over the years because good clamps were expensive and he didn't like debt. "What are you doing?" I asked her, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "Taking inventory," Darlene said, without looking up. "Somebody has to figure out what this business is worth now that Michael's gone." I told her I could help with that. That I had every serial number and purchase record filed at the office, going back years. Because part of my job had always been keeping equipment logs for insurance purposes. Darlene set down her pen and looked at me the way you look at a door-to-door salesman. "This isn't office work, Rachel," she said. "This is family business." I let it go that day, because I was still 3 weeks out from a funeral, and I did not have the strength to argue about a legal pad. That was my first mistake, and I want to be honest about that, because for a long time I mistook grief for weakness, and I let Darlene mistake my exhaustion for surrender. The second thing happened about 10 days later. When I went looking for the folder in the office filing cabinet where Mike and I kept the company's financial paperwork, the folder that held bank statements, canceled checks, and copies of every major purchase the business had made in the last 5 years. It was gone. Not misplaced, not shuffled to another drawer. Gone, along with the small metal lockbox that used to sit on the shelf above the cabinet. I asked Scott about it the next morning, catching him in the yard before he left for a job in Carnegie. Scott had always been an easier person to talk to than his mother, softer around the edges, quicker to laugh, but also quicker to fold when Darlene raised her voice in a room. "Mom's holding on to some paperwork," Scott said, not meeting my eyes. "Making sure everything's straight before the estate stuff starts. That paperwork includes documents with my name on them, Scott." "I know. It's fine. Nobody's trying to cut you out." "I want you to remember he said that sentence because it becomes important later. The way a lot of small denials become important once you start writing things down." The third object that told me something was wrong was the whiteboard in the shop office. The one where Mike used to write out the crew schedule every Sunday night, job by job, with his own handwriting, blue marker, block letters he'd learned from his father. 3 days after the missing folder, I walked into that office and found the board wiped completely clean. And in its place, in Darlene's looping cursive, was a list titled Items for Sale with 14 entries already written down. I stood in that doorway for a long time. Somewhere under the erasure dust was the last schedule Mike had ever written. A job in Mount Lebanon he never got to finish because he collapsed on a Tuesday morning loading his truck. Darlene had wiped it away without asking anyone, without even mentioning it. As if 11 months of illness and 1 funeral had been enough time to also erase the last thing he'd written with his own hand. I didn't say anything to her that day either. I went home and sat in my car in the driveway for 40 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Because the house felt too big and too quiet, and the workshop felt like it was slipping through my fingers, one object at a time. And I did not yet know how to stop it. The fourth blow came by way of a phone call. Not an object exactly, though it concerned one. Scott called to tell me the company truck, the one Mike had driven every day for 6 years, the one with our home address on the insurance, and a St. Christopher medal Mike's father had given him clipped to the visor, had been moved to Darlene's property for safekeeping. I asked why it needed safekeeping from me, since I was the one paying the insurance premium on it every month out of the joint account. Scott said Darlene thought it made more sense for the truck to be closer to the shop. It is closer to the shop, Scott. It's parked in my driveway. Mom's just trying to keep things organized, Rachel. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I remember hanging up the phone and standing in my kitchen holding it so tight my knuckles hurt. Because I was starting to understand that organized was Darlene's word for something else entirely. And that every phone call from Scott was going to be an apology for his mother, wrapped around a decision I hadn't been part of. If this story is starting to feel familiar to you, whether it happened with tools or a house, or something smaller nobody else noticed was missing, Drop a comment and tell me what your version of the whiteboard was.
I read every one. The fifth thing that happened was quieter than the others, and it hurt worse because of that.
About 3 weeks after the truck disappeared, I drove to the workshop on a Saturday morning to pick up a box of Mike's personal effects I'd left there. Mostly clothes from the small closet in the back office, where he used to keep a spare set of work clothes. When I got there, the lock on the side door had been changed. My key didn't work. I stood there, twisting a key that used to open that door every single day of my married life. And it just sat there in the new lock. Useless. And I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, the way water goes still right before it freezes. I called Darlene. She picked up on the fourth ring. "The lock's different," I said. "We had some tools go missing after the funeral," Darlene said. "You understand, with strangers coming through for the services, we had to be careful." "I'm not a stranger, Darlene. I'm his wife." "Were," she said. "You were his wife." I didn't say anything for a moment, because I genuinely did not know how to respond to a sentence like that from a woman who had hugged me at my own wedding and told everyone I was a good match for her son. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, the way you'd mentioned the weather, "Scott and I have been talking, and we think it makes sense to wind the business down properly. Sell off the equipment, settle up, let everyone move on. It's what's best for the family." "I am the family," I told her. "You're part of it," Darlene said. "That's different." That was the sixth wound, and it was the one that finally cracked something open in me. Not into anger yet, but into a kind of clarity I hadn't had since the diagnosis. Sitting in my car outside a workshop I couldn't enter, holding a key that didn't fit a lock that used to be mine. I stopped feeling like a widow being pushed aside by grief-stricken relatives, and I started feeling like a woman watching her own legal rights get quietly dismantled by people who assumed she was too tired and too sad to notice. That was the night I stopped pleading and started counting. I want to be precise about what that pivot looked like, because it wasn't dramatic. I didn't yell. I didn't confront anyone that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold, the same way that coffee would go cold in the workshop lot weeks later. And I opened my laptop and pulled up every digital file I had backed up from my 9 years of doing the company's compliance paperwork. Because permit coordinators, if we're any good at our jobs, back up everything, twice, in 2 different places. Out of professional habit, that has nothing to do with family drama and everything to do with surviving an inspector's audit. I found the equipment log I'd built years earlier for the business insurance policy, a spreadsheet listing every major tool and machine the company owned, cross-referenced with serial numbers, purchase dates, and receipts. I found scanned copies of purchase invoices going back 6 years. And then, buried in a folder labeled Company Restructure, Private, I found the document that changed everything. It was a ledger, 4 pages, typed and then hand-signed, dated 14 months before Mike died, back when he was still healthy, back before any of us knew what was coming. The header read, Voss Renovations, Buyout and Equipment Transfer Agreement. In it, Mike had bought out Scott's 25% ownership stake in the company equipment for $18,000, paid in 3 installments by canceled check. All 3 of which I found scanned in our joint bank records. The ledger listed every major piece of equipment by serial number, from the table saw to the laser level to the nail guns. And at the bottom of the 4th page, in Mike's own handwriting beneath the typed clause, it named a designated successor for the equipment and tool inventory in the event of his death, incapacity, or retirement. The name written there was mine, Rachel Voss, successor holder of company equipment and tool inventory, effective immediately upon execution of this agreement. Below that were 3 signatures. Mike's, in the strong, slanted hand I would have known anywhere. Scott's, smaller and more hesitant, like he'd been nervous signing away a piece of the business he'd grown up in. And a 3rd signature, one I hadn't expected, belonging to a man named Leo Marsh, who had been Voss Renovation's foreman for almost 15 years, ever since Mike's father was still running crews himself. I remembered, faintly, a Sunday afternoon over a year earlier, when Mike had asked Leo to stop by the shop to witness some paperwork, and I remembered thinking nothing of it at the time. Because paperwork was my job, not something Mike normally handled without me. And I'd been secretly pleased he was finally learning to take some of that burden on himself. I hadn't asked what the paperwork was. I regret that now, though I've made peace with it. Because grief teaches you that regret about small missed moments is its own kind of tax you pay forever, and there's no refund coming. I called Leo the next morning, before work, standing in my kitchen with the printed ledger in my hand. "Rachel," Leo said, and something in his voice told me he already suspected why I was calling. "I heard about the sale. Darlene mentioned it at the shop last week. Leo, do you remember signing something for Mike a little over a year ago? A buyout agreement? With Scott's name on it?" There was a pause on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "I remember," Leo said finally. "Mike had me come in on a Sunday. He said he wanted a witness who wasn't family, somebody who'd remember it clean if it ever mattered. He bought Scott's share of the equipment. Scott needed the cash for something, I think a down payment on his place in Carnegie. And Mike didn't want the shop tools split up if anything ever happened between them. He made me read the whole thing before I signed, so I'd know what I was putting my name to. Do you remember what it said about me?" "He named you," Leo said. "Said if anything ever happened to him, the tools and the shop equipment went to you, not to Scott, not to Darlene. Said you were the one who kept the paperwork straight anyway. And you'd know what to do with all of it better than anybody else in that family." I sat down at my kitchen table, and for the first time in months, I cried. The kind of crying that isn't only grief, the kind that has relief tangled up in it too. Because somewhere in the last year of his life, while he was already sick and scared and running out of time, Mike had thought far enough ahead to protect me from exactly the situation I was now standing in the middle of. He had known his family, known what they might do, and he had built a wall out of paper and signatures to keep me safe on the other side of it. "Leo," I said, "I need your help." "Whatever you need," he said. "Just tell me when." If you've ever found out someone you loved was quietly protecting you long after you thought their care had run out, I want to hear that story too, so go ahead and leave it in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss where this one goes. Over the next 10 days, I built what I started calling, in my own head, the proof engine, because that's exactly what it was. I printed the buyout ledger, all 4 pages, and highlighted the section naming me as successor. I printed the serial number equipment list I'd maintained for years, matching every tool on Darlene's items for sale list to a specific entry with a purchase date and a canceled check. I gathered copies of the 3 checks Mike had written to Scott, each one marked in the memo line, "Equipment buyout, per agreement," in Mike's own handwriting. Because he had always been the kind of man who wrote things down twice, once in a ledger and once on a check, out of an old-fashioned belief that paper never lied, even when people did. I called 2 other crew members, men who had worked for Voss Renovations for years. Men who had liked Mike and respected the way he ran a job site, and I asked them plainly whether they remembered anything about a buyout, or about Mike ever mentioning who would take over the equipment if something happened to him. Both of them, separately, told me the same thing Leo had told me, that Mike had said more than once. In the easy way men talk on a job site while framing a wall, that if anything ever happened to him, Rachel had the paperwork and Rachel would know what to do. I asked both of them if they'd be willing to sign a short witness statement confirming what they remembered, not as a legal document exactly, but as a record, because I had learned by then that the more names attached to the truth, the harder it becomes for anyone to pretend the truth doesn't exist. Both men agreed without hesitation. One of them, a quiet man named Dwayne, who had worked under Mike's father before Mike ever ran a crew, told me, Mike was good to us. We're not going to stand around and watch his wife get robbed. I want to pause here and say something plainly, because I think it matters. I did not build this evidence trail because I wanted a fight. I built it because I had spent 9 years of my marriage doing quiet, careful, unglamorous work that nobody at family dinners ever thanked me for. Work that only becomes visible the moment something goes wrong and somebody needs the truth in writing. Permit coordination teaches you that the world runs on paper trails, whether people like it or not. And I had spent my whole career making sure paper trails existed for buildings that could have hurt someone if they weren't documented properly. I decided I could do the same thing for my own life. Darlene set the date for the yard sale for a Saturday, 3.5 weeks after Mike's funeral. And she told Scott to spread the word to a few contractors she knew, people who might want good, used tools at a discount. She didn't tell me directly. I found out from Dwayne, who called me 2 days beforehand, sounding uncomfortable, and said, Rachel, I think you should know what's happening Saturday morning. Which brings us back to the gravel lot, the folding tables, the price gun, and the hammer with a $12 sticker curling in the wind. I arrived at 9 in the morning, the same time as the first 2 contractors Darlene had invited, men I didn't recognize. Standing near the table saw with their hands in their pockets, already looking it over like men who knew a bargain when they saw one. Darlene was at the far table with Scott, both of them tagging items, and the crew, 5 men including Leo, stood near the shop door, not helping. Not stopping it either, just watching the way people watch a house fire they don't have a hose for. I walked straight up to Darlene's table, and that's when she picked up the hammer and stuck the sticker on it, and said the line that had been building in her, I think, for weeks. You only married into this business, Rachel. You don't get to touch a man's tools. I set my coffee cup down on the corner of the table, very deliberately. The way you set something down when you want your hands free. Darlene, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. I need everyone to stop pricing anything for about 10 minutes. Excuse me? I have something I need Leo to read out loud before a single tool goes into anyone's truck. Darlene's face did something complicated. Somewhere between annoyance and the first flicker of alarm. This is not the time for whatever this is. It's exactly the time, I said, because once these leave the lot, we can't undo it. I turned to Leo, who was already stepping away from the shop door, and I handed him the folder I'd been carrying since I got out of my car, the folder with the ledger inside, printed and clipped, along with the serial number list and copies of the canceled checks. Leo, I said, would you read this at the workbench where everybody can hear you? Leo didn't hesitate. He walked to the nearest folding table, moved aside a box of clamps, set the folder down, and opened it flat. The way a man opens something he's handled before and respects. What is that? Scott asked, and something in his voice had already changed, gone tighter. like a man who suspects he already knows the answer to his own question. "It's the buyout agreement," Leo said. "The one Mike had me witness a little over a year ago." Darlene's mouth pressed into a thin line. "That's not relevant to today." "I think it's the most relevant thing here," Leo said. And then, without waiting for her permission, he began to read. He read the header first. Voss Renovations, Buyout and Equipment Transfer Agreement, in a plain, steady voice that carried across the gravel lot easily. Because Leo had spent 15 years giving instructions to crews over the sound of saws and generators. And he knew exactly how to make his voice reach every corner of a job site. He read the clause about Scott's 25% stake in the company equipment, purchased for $18,000. He read the payment schedule, 3 installments, and then he read the check numbers aloud, one at a time, pausing after each one. "Check 1104, Leo said. $6,000, dated February 14th. Check 1112, $6,000, dated March 14th. Check 1119, $6,000, dated April 14th. Memo line on all 3, same handwriting, reads, "Equipment buyout, per agreement." I watched Scott's face while Leo read those numbers. And I saw the exact moment recognition hit him. The way color drains out of a person's face when a memory they'd tucked away resurfaces uninvited. He remembered those checks. He'd cashed them. He'd used that money for a down payment on his house in Carnegie, the house he was still living in. "Scott," Darlene said, "say something." But Scott wasn't looking at his mother. He was looking at the folder, and specifically at the bottom of what Leo was now holding up, the page with 3 signatures on it. "That's my signature," Scott said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Read the successor clause," I told Leo. Leo turned to the 4th page, cleared his throat, and read Mike's handwritten line exactly as it was written. "Rachel Voss, successor holder of company equipment and tool inventory, effective immediately upon execution of this agreement. Superseding any prior or future claim by other family members, absent a new signed agreement executed by both Michael Voss and Rachel Voss." The lot went very quiet. One of the contractors near the table saw shifted his weight and glanced toward his truck. The kind of look a man gives an exit when he realizes he's wandered into something that isn't his business. Darlene recovered first, because Darlene always recovered first. That was simply who she was. "This doesn't prove anything," she said. "Michael could have written that a dozen different ways. People change their minds. He might have meant something different by it later." "Did he ever tell you he changed his mind?" I asked her. "He didn't discuss business with me the way he should have," Darlene snapped, which was, I noted quietly, the truest thing she'd said all morning. "He discussed it with Leo," I said, "because he wanted a witness outside the family who'd remember it clean. He discussed it with Scott, because Scott signed it and cashed the checks. And he discussed it with me every single day for 9 years, because I was the one who kept every piece of paperwork this company has ever filed. I have the equipment log with every serial number cross-referenced to this ledger. I have the canceled checks. I have written statements from Dwayne and from Pete confirming Mike told them, more than once, that I was the one who'd have the paperwork if anything ever happened." Darlene's hands had gone still on the table in front of her, resting on top of a laser level with a green sticker that read $40. "You planned this," she said, and there was something almost admiring buried underneath the accusation. The way people sometimes resent competence in the very moment they're forced to recognize it. "You came here today ready for this." "I came here today," I said, "because you scheduled a sale of equipment that legally belongs to me. And you did it without telling me. And you tagged my husband's hammer while telling the crew I don't have the right to touch it? I didn't plan a fight, Darlene. I planned to stop being erased. Scott set down the item he'd been holding, a cordless drill still in its case, and looked at his mother. Mom, if that's real, if that's actually what he signed, we can't sell any of this.
It was never ours to sell.
Don't you dare take her side, Darlene said, whipping around to face him. I'm not taking sides, Scott said, and his voice cracked slightly. The way a man's voice cracks when he's choosing honesty over comfort for maybe the first time in a long while. I'm reading my own signature, Mom. I remember signing it. I remember why. I needed the down payment money, and Mike gave it to me, and in exchange, I gave up my share of the tools. He told me that day he wanted things settled clean, in case something happened, so nobody would have to fight about it later. He looked at me, and something in his face looked almost apologetic, almost young. I forgot, or I didn't want to remember. I don't know which is worse. Both, I said. But I said it without cruelty, because I understood in that moment that Scott's failure had been weakness, not malice. And those are different sins, even if they land the same way on the person standing in the wreckage. Darlene wasn't finished, though. She never went down without one more attempt. Even if that ledger is real, she said, her voice climbing, sharper now, aimed at the two contractors still standing awkwardly near the table saw, as if she needed an audience to make her point land. This woman is not a builder. She's never swung a hammer in her life. She sat behind a desk while my son built this company with his hands. What does she know about running a crew, about running any of this? I know every code requirement this company has ever had to meet, I said. I know every permit filed for every job in the last 9 years. I know which inspectors we've worked with, which suppliers give us the best terms, which invoices are still outstanding, and which jobs are scheduled for next month that this crew is still expecting to get paid for. I have run the compliance side of this business quietly for almost a decade, Darlene, while everyone in this family assumed I was just answering phones. I don't need to swing a hammer to know how to keep this company standing. I turned to the crew, who had stayed silent by the shop door through all of it. I'm not asking any of you to pick a side today because of loyalty to me, I said. I'm asking you to look at the paperwork Leo just read and decide for yourselves whose name is actually on it. If you want to keep working, the company isn't closing. The equipment isn't being sold. I intend to keep Voss Renovations running, and I intend to keep every one of you employed, because that's what Mike would have wanted. And frankly, it's what the paperwork says has to happen, unless somebody wants to challenge it in court, which they are welcome to try. Dwayne spoke first. I'm not walking off a job that still has my name on the schedule, he said. Rachel's always been straight with us on pay and permits. I'll take that over a family feud any day. The other men nodded, one by one. Quiet agreements that meant more to me in that moment than any speech could have. Leo closed the folder gently, the way you close something you've decided matters, and set it back down on the table in front of me instead of in front of Darlene. I think we're done here, Leo said, looking at the two contractors near the table saw. Sails off, fellas. Sorry for the trip out. The contractors left without argument, the way strangers do when they sense a family's business has become too complicated for a stranger's convenience. The gravel lot slowly emptied of the small crowd Darlene had gathered, until it was just the crew, and Scott, and Darlene, and me, standing among folding tables covered in tools that were, once again, unmistakably mine. Before we get to how this settled, if you've made it this far, I'd love it if you left a comment with one word describing how you'd have felt standing in that lot. It genuinely helps me know this story is landing. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. Darlene did not apologize that day. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one are more useful when they don't pretend every ending comes wrapped in forgiveness. She gathered her legal pad and her price gun, and she walked to her car without another word to me. Though she did stop by Scott's truck long enough to say something to him I couldn't hear, in a tone that made him flinch. Scott stayed behind after she left. He walked over to the table, where his own signature sat exposed on a page he'd apparently forgotten existed. And he picked up the cordless drill case he'd been holding earlier, the one with a $40 tag stuck to the handle. This was his favorite drill, Scott said quietly. He used to let me borrow it when I was starting out, before I had my own tools. I forgot that, too. He peeled the price tag off, slowly, careful not to leave any adhesive residue on the case, and set it on the workbench in front of me. "I'm sorry, Rachel," he said. "Not because Leo made me. Because I should have remembered on my own, and I let Mom talk me into pretending I hadn't signed anything, because it was easier than standing up to her. That's on me." I didn't tell him it was fine, because it wasn't. Not entirely. And I've learned that pretending small betrayals don't matter is its own kind of dishonesty. But I told him I appreciated him saying it, and that the door to working things out between us wasn't closed. Even if it would take longer than one Saturday morning in a gravel lot to walk all the way through it. Over the following weeks, Scott quietly returned 2 more toolboxes that had ended up at Darlene's house before I'd even discovered the buyout ledger. Boxes he brought over one at a time, without making a show of it, leaving them just inside the shop door with a short text message each time. He started showing up to job sites again, working under the schedule I posted. Treating me the way you'd treat a boss you respected, but hadn't quite forgiven yourself around yet. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was something more useful than warmth. It was reliability. Darlene never came back to the shop. She sent one email, weeks later, through a lawyer, questioning the validity of the ledger, and my own attorney responded with copies of the canceled checks. The serial number cross-reference, and the 3 witness statements from Leo, Dwayne, and Pete. I never heard from her lawyer again after that, and I never heard from Darlene directly either. Not a call, not a visit, not so much as a message at Christmas. Some doors, once they close, apparently stay closed, and I have made a kind of peace with that too. Because I did not build the proof engine to win Darlene's love. I built it to protect what my husband had spent his last healthy months trying to protect for me. Voss Renovations is still running. It's smaller now than it was in Mike's best years, but every man who stood in that gravel lot that Saturday still works for the company. And we've added one new hire since, a young apprentice Dwayne recommended, who reminds me a little of Mike at 25, according to the older guys on the crew. I still do every permit, every inspection, every piece of compliance paperwork myself, the same work I always did, except now I also sign the checks. And I keep the ledger updated, and I make sure every serial number in that shop is documented in triplicate. Because I never again want to stand in a lot watching someone else decide what belongs to me. A few months after the yard sale that never happened, I was cleaning out the drawer of Mike's old workbench. The one Darlene had been standing at that first day I found her taking inventory. Underneath a stack of receipts and a broken tape measure, I found a carpenter pencil, the flat kind with the wide lead, worn down to about half its original length, with the initials MV carved crudely into the wood near the eraser end. The way Mike used to carve his initials into every pencil, so nobody on a crowded job site could claim it was theirs. I didn't cry when I found it, not the way I had on the night I found the ledger. This was a quieter feeling. something closer to recognition than grief.
The way you feel when you find proof that a person you loved was exactly as careful and exactly as thoughtful as you always believed them to be.
Even in the smallest, least noticed objects they left behind. I keep that pencil in a drawer in my own desk now, at the office, where I still coordinate permits for jobs across the city. And some mornings, before I open the day's paperwork, I take it out and hold it for a moment, feeling the worn, flat edge under my thumb, the carved initials rough against my skin.
It reminds me that Mike never once doubted I could carry this forward, that he had marked his tools and his intentions with the same plain, careful hand.
Trusting that if the day ever came when I needed proof of what was mine, I would know exactly where to look and exactly how to read it. I know how to read it now.
I read it out loud once in a gravel lot full of folding tables, and I have never once regretted a single word.